Hello and welcome to the second of our two special panel discussions on innovation in the telecom sector, which are looking in particular at the role of technology startups in the telecom industry. Now, in the first panel, we spoke to industry analyst Caroline Chappell and representatives from two of the industry's main operators, and that was Diego Lopez from Telefonica and Klaus Martini from Deutsche Telekom. Now, all three of those are co-authors of a new paper which is available to download from Telecom TV, and that paper is called Accelerating Innovation in the Telecommunications Arena. Now, the two other co-authors of that paper are with us on today's panel, and they are Don Clark, who is Principal Consultant at Telecom Foresight Consulting, and Mark Cummings, who is CTO at Orchestral Networks. Also on today's panel, we have a special guest, and that is Andrew Coward, who is the CEO of Telecoms technology startup Lumina Networks. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Good to have you all here. So let's start with you, Don. Don, can you just tell us about your role in the development of this paper and the specific challenges that startups have in the telecom sector? I mean, are the challenges that they have, is it different from other industry verticals, for example? And is there a way in which startups in telecoms can be encouraged rather than crushed, as they often are?
Hello, Ray. So I've spent most of my career, in fact, probably all of my career in telecom R&D. A couple of years actually over in operations, but most of that time has been dealing with companies large and small who wanted to sell their products to into the telecoms industry, specifically to BT when I was there, and then into the cable industry when I was at Cable Labs. The idea of the ecosystem has always been very close to my heart. I'm a collaborative animal. I've pulled together industry collaborations. I've pulled together collaborations with individual vendors when I was at BT and again at Cable Labs. And it was pretty obvious really from the very early days the difficulties that companies have in engaging with telecoms operators. From an R&D perspective, our focus on technology in some ways makes things very simple. We say, what do I need in my network going forward into the future, and who can supply that? So we engage with companies to tell us how the technology is evolving and to help them position their technology. But clearly, when it came to procurement, then you jump into a whole different ballgame. And I'm pleased to be on this panel with two colleagues, Andrew and Mark, who will give us some interesting perspectives from the other side of the table. But from the side of the table that I was on, in the telecoms operator space, it was even pretty obvious to me the difficulties there. For example, if we assemble a request for information or a request for product, then it often involved many hundreds of pages of requirements. And one of those things that we did in the paper, and thanks Ray for referencing that, the paper sets out, if you like, the landscape for the industry. What is it that the industry, what characteristics of our industry specifically incentivize or disincentivize startups? And we referenced in there the complexity of the industry, the complexity of regulation, the global scale, the volumetric and geographic scale, and we try and outline those things. But the point of the paper is really to try and trigger an industry discussion. So my role in it was, I guess I was the managing editor. How this thing came about, well, I'll blame Mark for that, because Mark approached several of us and said, you guys, can you help the ecosystem become a little bit more friendly for companies like mine? So that's how we got going, and I'm pleased to talk to you today about some of that.
Excellent. And from your experience in the telecom industry, Don, do you think it's harder for startups in telecoms rather than maybe some of the other industries? Do you get any sense that it's maybe tougher for small innovative companies in telecoms rather than another industry vertical?
Well, the cable industry and the telecommunications operator industry are very similar, and those are really the bounds of my experience. I recognize the complexity of my industry, and particularly the way in which the telecoms industry underpins national ecosystems, and they are and is a critical national infrastructure. And building data communications networks is highly complex. I can't directly reference other industries, and perhaps I would maybe refer to Mark. I think Mark's got some pretty broad views on other industries. I think telecoms probably is pretty unique in terms of the global scale, the fact that most telecoms operators around the world actually deploy pretty much the same stuff, but that kind of long time installed infrastructure, for example, going all the way back perhaps 100 years or more for the telephone network, that layer upon layer of evolution of technology, which is unlike many other industries, probably does give us a unique problem. So that's pretty much where I would stand on this at the moment.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Don. So yes, Mark, let's turn to you. So, I mean, you're somebody with a great deal of experience of working at startups. You founded a number of companies. I mean, would you say that, say, in the past 10 or 15 years, that operating conditions have become harder for startups in the telecom industry? And is there any particular challenges that a company like Orchestral Networks is facing right now?
Great question, Ray. First, to be an entrepreneur, you have to be optimistic. To be an entrepreneur selling to telcos, you have to be pathologically optimistic. And I plead guilty on that score. Second, I've seen this movie before. I've seen it a few times. The one that's most dramatic was what happened with Western Union in the 1970s. In the 1970s, Western Union had a network in the United States that was a little bit smaller than AT&T's, but the same order of magnitude. And they were primarily offering a service, a telex service, using Bordeaux-based teletypewriters. They had a 15 baud and a 25 baud service. When the first ASCII 30-bit per second modems, dial-up modems came out, the company decided it had to respond, and their response was to make a 30 baud telex service and to get their whole ecosystem to build a 30 baud teletypewriters. In 5 to 10 years, that whole network disappeared. It just kind of dried up and blew away, and Western Union exited the communication service provider industry. Now, I think that potential exists in the telco industry now as we make this transition to software networks. But again, I'm pathologically optimistic. I think that it's possible for the telecommunications industry, for the telcos and the cable companies to make the changes that are necessary. And I see this coming together of my friends and colleagues to work on this as a really positive sign. But yes, the last 10 or 15 years, things have gotten more difficult. What's happened is the telcos were facing this fundamental change, they and their large vendors retreated and tried to do things more the old way. And so what we saw was mergers and acquisitions and the vendor community shrinking. And then geopolitical forces got in the way. And so there's very few places now where a telco can, they primarily buy from 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 vendors. And if, as a startup, if you can sell your technology to one of those vendors, then you have a chance. But as those vendors merge and they become more dedicated to legacy product lines, and they become less and more threatened by outside innovation, and so they kind of pull up the drawbridges. And if that continues, of course, it's not going to be a sign for a healthy industry. And I think telco is really a fundamental fundamentally important for society because it's the last place where people pay for content. And if the superscalers take over the actual transmission as well as all of the information services that sit on top of it, then we're kind of committed to all of the problems that we're seeing in social media and the other superscalers with surveillance and advertising having some fairly negative social impacts. Of course, it's better for me too if the telco industry figures out how to work with startups.
Absolutely. And I do get the sense that there is a willingness to try and broaden the scope from the operator side these days, as well as from the supplier side. So, Andrew, what do you think could be done to help improve the relationships between smaller companies and the telecom operators that they are trying to do business with? Is there any kind of different or new relationship model that could be introduced into the ecosystem?
Well, I think the good news is that most telcos recognize this as a problem, and they've put groups together, investment teams and so on, to help. And this is being called curation of startups, which as a startup makes me feel like I'm an exhibit in a museum. What we actually kind of need, and certainly for the investors that we have in Lumina, namely AT&T and Verizon, they've done a very good job of this, is what we call shepherding. So it's not sufficient to say, okay, yes, we're going to give you capital and go have at it. You need the assistance that the large vendors naturally have because they put teams of 20 or 30 people onto these accounts minimum. So how do you get an order through the system? How do you negotiate a contract? How do you go through the myriad of things that need to happen for your product to actually get to deployment? And who is going to help you and champion that? And for all the relationships that you might have for the sophistication of the technology you're providing or the value you're providing, it is not enough if you cannot get through all those hurdles. And those hurdles, there are many, for the years that it can take to get to deployment, for the things that typically a very large vendor is required to do are exerted onto small vendors, onto startups. ISO 9001 certifications, for example, or insurance policies in the tens of millions of dollars. All these things have to be made to go away or given a time frame to go deliver on, versus saying, okay, you're excluded because you can't fill one of these 100 tick boxes or all of these 100 tick boxes. So that's what shepherding is about, and it's way more active than curation and a requirement for startups to be successful.
Okay, so that sounds quite encouraging, but just briefly, Andrew, are you confident that this kind of relationship model could become the norm, that things might get easier for small technology startups and telecoms on a broader scale, no matter whether they're in North America, Europe, Asia, wherever?
Well, I think if we can drive these kind of what I call best practices on how to work in a startup ecosystem, so shepherding all this stuff is great. What's not happening and needs to happen is a shift in capital expenditure onto startups, onto these new technologies. And obviously, telcos are very risk averse, as we've established. But see, if you think about putting to a long time frame, so a 5-year plan, what percentage of CapEx is going to be spent in 5 years' time on new vendors? Best practice suggests that if you want to get to these new technologies, you need to make a plan to do that. And so, from a startup perspective, what that means is I can see revenue today. I can see that growing. I can take that to the VC community, which is largely ruled themselves out of investments in telco startups because of these things, and say, look, I have a plan. Here's the commitment. Here's what's happening. You can see the growth. And the investments is absolutely the norm that will drive that, right? So I guess we've got this kind of feedback loop, if you like, from CapEx being spent by the telcos, commitment to the VC community getting re-engaged to complete not return to normality, if you like, of this startup world in telco.
Okay, yeah, and that might be quite challenging to get that loop going on a regular basis, and for a lot of companies. So obviously a lot of the activity, a lot of the change needs to come from the telecom operator side of things, if anything is to happen here. So Don, is there anything that the operators can do to help themselves and to open up their chances, to make their chances greater of working and discovering more innovative startups, and so gain a greater access to a more broad and diverse range of opportunities?
That's a good question, Ray. That's been very close to my mind too for quite a few years. After I joined Cable Labs back in 2014, a new initiative there was quite interesting that started up. A guy called Scott Brown, who's a kind of serial entrepreneur and well known in the startup industry, he created this a kind of shepherding or curating organization within Cable Labs that was called UpRamp. And UpRamp represented exactly what I thought was necessary, which is to say that you have a global cable industry which consisted, I think at the time, Cable Labs was a consortium of 57 or so cable operators representing hundreds of millions of cable connectors, cable customers across the world. And it seemed logical to us at Cable Labs that we could have a role to shepherd, curate, I like Andrew's word, shepherding startups into the cable industry. So UpRamp started up, I think, in about 2015, 2016, and started out with pitch events, for example, in Silicon Valley. And those pitch events resulted in a competition for investment by cable operators. And we took into what we call the UpRamp Fiterator 4 companies every year based on that competition. And then what we did with those individual startups was that we then actually established a relationship with them. And of course, in selecting the startups, we brought to them our knowledge of what the requirements were, where are the hot buttons in terms of new capabilities that the cable operators needed, and we articulated those as part of that whole process. And then once we'd selected those startups to engage with the cable industry for about a year, we then made available to them individual experts in the technologies within the cable industry, the kind of relationships that would have been almost impossible to establish had a startup randomly approached an individual operator. Because part of the difficulty is, well, who do you talk to, right? Who do you talk to in a big operator to sell your product? And I'm sure Andrew and Mark have had this experience. And quite often it would land on my desk, right? The CTO would say, "Hey, Don, we've got some fiber technology. Would you talk to this company that wrote to me?" And that's kind of, it would come down the chain. So UpRamp Fiterator is much more proactive. This was then to then establish a relationship with an individual cable operator. So a particular cable operator was willing to put its resources into helping the startup understand its requirements, and then effectively then help the startup to shape its proposition from both a technology perspective often, but also from, more importantly often, an operational perspective. So the UpRamp Fiterator was an interesting idea. I don't think UpRamp is any longer in operation. I have to go back to Cable Labs Ray and talk to them about it. But I think something like that, if we could establish a collaborative effort across the industry where operators take some kind of ownership of a particular thread of capability that the industry needs, then we can obviously share the resources across the industry too. So that's some of the thinking that I'm currently have. How could we kind of take the UpRamp Fiterator idea and establish that in the cable industry? So that's something I'm pondering right now.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, that does sound like a really good model, where a startup would be able to engage once and reach many rather than having to broker all those individual relationships. But of course, all of this time, small companies, they need resources, they need money, they need people, they need time, and they don't always have these resources. So I'm wondering if there are any alternative funding structures to what we have now, funding processes that could be introduced to give startups a greater opportunity, greater security, and enable them to be able to focus on really what they're around to do, which is to innovate and develop. Mark, do you think there are any different funding processes or models that could be introduced or examined?
Yes, Ray. I think it's really the heart of the problem. You build an ecosystem by providing a food source, and everything that Andrew has said is important. Everything that Don has said is important. But without food, everything dies. And the food, in this case, is money. And the telco industry has felt, because they've been dealing with large vendors, that they've been forced to pay too much for these large procurements. And so they have there has been in the past this general policy of trying to get everything in new technology for free, and to force the big vendors to provide new technology demonstrations for free. The big vendors consider that just a cost of doing business, and maybe they field something and maybe they don't, but they continue, of course, to sell the product lines that they have a big investment in. So the innovation, particularly in software, comes from small companies. But if, as a telco, you want to engage with small companies, you have to pay them for what they do. And what you want to do is create a funnel. You want to have small amounts of money to start with kind of theoretical considerations of new technology, and then a little bit larger, and you filter down as you go, a little bit larger for proof of concepts. And then not all the proof of concepts are going to work, and so a few of them will fall through to lab tests, and then you spend more on lab tests, and then a few of them fall through the lab tests to a field test, a small field deployment, and then a few of those actually fall through to actual full-scale deployment. And you constantly are feeding this funnel from the top with new potential innovation, and you accept the fact that some of it is not going to work, and that's why you have kind of a portfolio approach. You bring in more at the top of the funnel and filter as you go down. But from the point of view of the startup, if you can do what you say you can do, and you actually provide value to the telco, then you have an assurance that you can go through this process and get to full-scale deployment. And if you have that assurance, then you can raise capital. Without that, you can't raise capital. And then there's a VC who says that the telcos love startups. They love them so much they hug them to death, and that doesn't produce innovation. Okay,
yeah. So I mean, that I guess that puts quite a lot of trust on the side of the companies that are then feeding that funnel. Andrew, any thoughts? Any models that you've come across elsewhere, or that you think might work better to help innovative startups keep going and be able to focus on what they do best?
Yeah, well, for sure, it's a money discussion, right? And it's about being paid for the technology early on in the cycle, so that you can expand and grow into it. The inverse often happens as we negotiate with new customers. They say, okay, because it's a new technology, we want a success-based payment outcome over 3 years, and we'll pay you the bulk of what our traditional vendors would get up front. We'll pay you that in 3 years' time if it turns out the solution's successful. And it's a kind of an inversion of what's actually needed for the startups. And again, it goes back to risk aversion and saying, well, I don't want to risk what is a relatively small amount of money. I'm talking hundreds of thousands of dollars here versus tens or hundreds of millions, which is what they're spending with traditional vendors, to even risk that, if you like, until they've seen successful deployments and outcomes is just inversely wrong. And so there needs to be a recognition as startups work in each of these telcos. And we'll stand on our own 2 feet. We'll prove our technology. We don't need help with that. But what can't happen is for that startup to be then penalized, essentially, in a way that the traditional vendors are. There's a higher, a much longer return on investment, paradoxically, that a startup has to get their money back in this environment than there is for a traditional vendor, and that's what's broken. So again, going back to the shepherding model, if you're in this, okay, you're a startup, okay, you're in this program. This is what it means when we go through the pilot. This is what it means when we go to deployment. We're not going to hang on to the money for 180 days. You're going to get paid in 30 days or 60 days. These are just things that are, are fundamental to the lifeblood of the startup community and why it's been drained, if you like, of new startups and new companies willing to go into the space and VC money and so on. It's just because of this gap between getting the product into the network and getting paid for it at a reasonable level. And if we don't change that, then fundamentally nothing's going to improve. And we'll get to the stagnation that we've really seen in innovation in telco, over the last 5 years.
Okay, interesting. Well, I'm sure there are plenty of other small startups, innovative companies out there thinking the same thing, agreeing with you, but who maybe have other ideas as well. And I think, from what I'm hearing from all of you is that the paper that has been written and the discussions we're having now, that these should be the starting point, the catalyst for more ideas, for bringing ideas together to try and actually change things rather than just be talking about it. So, Don, in terms of this initiative, what should happen next? What can happen next? Is it a case of bringing more ideas together and seeing what could work?
It's the next step that's really important. What we've done with the paper, which people can download, is simply we've laid out the landscape with a fairly brutal articulation of what is the problem, right? In the paper, we make a couple of proposals which are fairly lightweight and easy to accommodate. But really, I think, as Andrew points out, this is a very serious problem now for the industry. My big concern is that we simply won't get entrepreneurs engaging with us. And we know that has been a problem. 2 or 3 years ago, I saw analysts that was basically saying, don't invest in the telecom industry because you're not going to get any return anytime soon. And that's extremely worrying. Back in the day when I started in telecoms, I won't even say what year it was, the investment by governments in telecommunications was enormous. They were the engines of innovation for countries, right? So, BT Labs was the engine of innovation back in the 1960s. We've long passed that point, and it's not appropriate to go back to that kind of model. What we need is a market-driven model where entrepreneurs are falling over themselves to come into our industry because they're going to get an exciting opportunity, and right now that doesn't exist. Part of the NFV thing, which which is pretty old hat these days, back in 2012, was to say softwareization gives an opportunity now for startups to have bite-sized chunks of the telecom network, meaning that if you've got a software capability, we can now accommodate that, and it's not part of a big iron box solution that has to come from a big vendor. And so we're going through a transition which Mark emphasizes quite a lot of softwareization. That ought to provide an opportunity for almost anybody with a great idea to come in. But then we run into things, well, who's going to integrate that solution then? Because now you're looking at, there's a kind of an integration problem. And typically that's been the realm of the large vendors, and even today probably remains in that realm. So coming back to the question, what do we want to do next? It really is, let's have ideas. We invite in the paper, what do you think? Have we identified the problem? What have we missed? What ideas could come in to help solve this problem? So I think for the first time, at least in my recollection, we're going to encourage a discussion across the industry on processes for innovation. And that, I think, is a new dialogue. It ought to be exciting because with the idea that we're now implementing our networks inside cloud infrastructures, where almost anyone's great algorithm could be deployed in theory, but we're breaking it because of the problems that Andrew's articulated. So the next step is, first of all, please read our paper, and if you agree with the problem, then contact us. And we want to facilitate a dialogue. So probably looking at the old August, dead time of August, where most of Europe is on holiday. I live in the US, so don't have holidays in August. But we want to come back in around about the September timeframe and have some kind of discussion, an orchestrated discussion, and then to have that ongoing over the next few months to really come to a conclusion on what needs to happen. Now, in terms of the players in that discussion, I'm used to talking to telecoms guys, right? I mean, we bore each other rigid with the same old things. I'm interested in likes of Andrew and Mark coming in with your startup experience. What about the over-the-top players? What about the cloud operators? What about the applications providers? What ideas have they got that, bearing in mind that they depend on telecommunications for their business model, so it ought to be in their interest to engage with us to figure out how we can make the telecoms network even better for them.
Absolutely, and it would be fantastic to get that broader ecosystem of what is now the communications service provider community involved in this discussion. Absolutely. Andrew, for you, what would be the key takeaway from this discussion or this paper? What would be the one thing that you would like to leave in people's minds and take away from this?
Well, I think we need to get to best practice, industry best practice. And if we take the best of what the telcos are already doing, combine it into a single place, a single document with new ideas too, that becomes the way that we shepherd startups into telcos and reignite the innovation process that, after all, brought us so much over the last 20, 30 years and the internet at large. And with that and commitments from telcos to invest not in over-the-top things, but in infrastructure startups, not the apps that run on top of it, but how the network is actually going to run, that will lead to a return to the VC investment cycle and a much healthier ecosystem. And once we have best practice in place, it's hard to dispute that you shouldn't be following them, right? And that's the reset that we need right now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andrew. And Mark, what for you is the key takeaway here?
So I think Andrew has articulated very well. In order to do what Andrew's suggesting, which is to have a kind of consensus around best practices, we need to get technology innovation. We're going to need to have cultural innovation and organizational innovation in our telcos and our cable companies, in the CSPs. The culture is designed to do something that worked a couple of generations ago. The organizational structure is designed to do something that worked a couple of generations ago. The world's changed. This softwareization has fundamentally changed the nature of the world. And if telcos are going to prosper and survive, and if the ecosystem that supports telcos is going to prosper and survive, it has to be successful in the new world. If it's not, then what's happening is you're opening up in ecosystem niches for the superscalers. And we're already seeing the superscalers move down into communication service provision. So that's the challenge.
Okay, great. Excellent. Well, as mentioned at the beginning, this is the second of two panels, both of which, along with the paper, are really acting as the catalysts for further discussion on this point. And you can find that first panel discussion and also the paper, which, as a reminder, is titled Accelerating Innovation in the Telecommunications Arena, on the Telecom TV website, along with further coverage of this topic. And as mentioned already, the paper's authors are very keen to get feedback from anybody in the industry that's got something to add, an idea that they want to share. So in the paper, you will find the contact details of the 5 authors, and they are prepared to receive any ideas or thoughts from the industry to move this conversation along and bring that to the debating chamber that hopefully we can help as well to host in part here at Telecom TV. So for now, I want to thank our panelists from today, and I want to thank you for watching, and I hope you'll all get involved in what is an incredibly important debate about innovation in the telecoms industry.